Hello there, everybody. I'm back again. Richard Koenigsberg, Library of Social Science, and I've sent out a couple of posts today on World War I and the body politic, how the body of human beings are destroyed by the body politic. Here's a photograph. If you haven't seen, I don't know exactly how to present this. Yeah, there we go. It's men who have lost their legs in the First World War, and they look kind of proud and very dignified. So my hypothesis is that war is a form of self-destruction or sacrifice. I think it's a delusion to imagine that warfare actually seeks gain, even though this is the way the rational approach in Western civilization tends to look at it, as if there's something to be gained by warfare. And I'm not making an anti-war statement, although implicitly it would be. I'm actually simply stating what the reality is of warfare. And here are some of the statistics of the First World War. 65 million men mobilized, 8.5 million killed, 21 million wounded, 7.7 million wounded in action, total 37 million casualties. 57% of all people mobilized. What was this all about? I've studied it for 20 years. I first became aware of World War I after I had been studying the Holocaust for many, many years and studying Hitler for many years. And I felt I'd resolved most of the issues and understood what was going on. And then I was at the NYU library, and I walked over to the other section of the library, and I started reading all these books about First World War. And I assumed that they must have known what was going on, that it happened for some good reason. But as it turned out, there was no good reason, and there isn't any good reason. And really, the historians can't explain it. So I tried to find an explanation for many, many, many years, but I could not find an explanation. So I gradually developed the hypothesis that war exists as a medium, and the First World War, being a case study, exists as a way of sacrificing human beings to the nation state. This is a very radical hypothesis for historians who have been writing about it endlessly, although when I state it now, after all these years of writing about it and dealing with it and discussing normal human beings, then I realize it kind of seems self-evident. If there's any other hypothesis to account for this mass slaughter, I would appreciate if someone would tell me about it. And no one has been able to tell me about it in all these years. But like many things in human culture, people don't like it to talk about it. And there were certain things when I started my newsletter that I was kind of frightened that it was going to disturb people. But I realized that in the modern world, people, well, Freud once said when they burned all his books, he said, well, we've made a lot of progress. In the earlier days, they would have burned me, but now they just burned his books. In the contemporary world, the way people deal with disturbing ideas is simply denying them or ignoring them or not trying to look at reality. So my newsletter gave me the opportunity to express what was initially a radical idea, and gradually it became less and less radical as more and more people wrote for my newsletter and gave some validation to the idea, until about a year ago, the New York Times wrote something about this idea. that nations require the sacrifice of soldiers. Now, in recent years, the sacrificial mechanism has become less and less profound. People no longer have this motivation that they did during the First World War, where they seemed so willing to die for their country. Or if not willing, at least they went along with it. They volunteered. Millions of men volunteered, and this is what it meant to be a hero. So the whole idea of heroism lay at the heart of warfare at that time. Somebody did a panel for the American Anthropology Association on my work, talking about the best hero is the dead hero. So you can see from the photograph, if you have a copy on Facebook, all these men without legs. This was the next best thing that could happen to a soldier in terms of his heroic potential. If he didn't die, at least he could be wounded. And this proved that you were sincere in your devotion to the nation state. Hitler was one of the people who participated in World War I. He saw 2 million of his own, well, he didn't see 2 million, he saw tens of thousands of his own colleagues, his own compatriots slaughtered in the First World War. There's accounts of what he must have seen in the trenches. And after the war was over, he was quite aware that 2 million Germans had died in the war. But somehow, he could never come down against war. There's Meha Chan in the background. She's the book exhibit manager. She's looking in. She's kind of shy, even though she's not shy because she wants to show how young she looks. Even though she's 90, she looks like she's 35. Very unusual. But Asian women like to maintain their youth and their slim appearance, as I'm sure everyone knows. So getting back to Hitler, he was aware of all the horrible things that happened to his comrades in the First World War, and yet he didn't protest against it. He said, finally, it would be a sin to complain, for after all, were they not dying for Germany? And herein lies the whole issue, sin to complain, because people are dying for the country. So these two variables are profoundly connected. The idea of dying or sacrificing one's life or fighting in war, and the idea of the nation state. The two go together like love and marriage go together. Frank Sinatra used to sing love and marriage go together like a horse and carriage. I can't use this analogy anymore because love and marriage don't go together too well. In fact, there's not much marriage as there used to be. And love is something that is very, very rare, even though people pretend that's something that everybody can have if they only try hard enough. And the Beatles sang, all we need is love. And yeah, we may need it, but it's not that easy to come by. Getting back to Hitler, he said it would be a sin to complain, for after all, were they not dying for Germany? And my hypothesis is that is why people do not recognize the radicalness of the First World War. They take it for granted. Why? Because all these people died for the country. And as long as there are things such as countries, then somehow the dying makes sense. John Lennon said, imagine there's no country, but people seem to be unable to do that. People are obsessed with the country, even though they don't die for the country in the way they once did. So Hitler then never abandoned the idea of warfare. He eventually started the Second World War, and he was determined not to save his colleagues, but to engage in even greater degree of sacrifice. A greater degree of sacrifice. And he was determined to send the soldiers into battle. And this was imperative in Nazi Germany, to be willing to sacrifice. And I've developed the hypothesis over the years, which I think I've proven, that the Jews were hated by Hitler and other Germans because they symbolized the unwillingness to sacrifice. They were the individualists that refused to participate in the nation. They were unwilling to die for the country, and therefore they weren't virtuous. So to make a long story short, Hitler then witnessed or understood that his soldiers were dying on the Eastern Front. This was at the beginning of the war in June 1941. It's called Operation Barbarossa, which he called the War of Extermination. Now, people think Hitler actually wanted to win the war. What a fanatic, fantastic idea, fighting a war against Great Britain, then fighting a war against the United States, then fighting a war in the Middle East, then fighting a war all of Europe, and then he attacks the Soviet Union. So basically, Hitler's real objective was extermination. And the idea of extermination focused on the Jewish Bolsheviks, the communists, which he called Jewish Bolsheviks. If he hadn't called them Jewish Bolsheviks, he would have simply been waging a war against communism, and it would have been much easier. But he identified communists with Jews, with no evidence whatsoever, by the way. There was a very small percent of the Communist Party that was actually Jewish. But this was the megalomaniac, paranoid fantasy of Hitler and Goebbels and Himmler, that somehow the Jews were going to take over the world, and he had to destroy the Jews before the Jews destroyed him. So it was a paranoid fantasy. The idea was that the Jews were dangerous, and therefore he had to kill all the Jews before they killed him. So getting back to this sacrificial mechanism, so in June 1941, the Germans started dying in the Second World War. And Hitler then started reflecting. The Jews at that point were in concentration camps, but the final solution had not yet begun. So Hitler provided a justification for the final solution, and he connected it to the sacrifice of the soldiers. And in some way, this is my final solution to the problem of the Holocaust. He said, if I have the right to send the pick of the German people into the hell of war without consideration for the spilling of precious German blood, then naturally I have the right to destroy millions of an inferior race that breed like vermin. What I'm suggesting is that the Holocaust, as a form of sacrifice, the Holocaust means burnt offering, built on the alage, or the bedrock, as I often use that word recently, of the sacrifice of his own soldiers. Hitler understood in some way that he was sacrificing his own soldiers. He understood that that was the fundamental purpose of warfare, really, to get your own people to die for their country, just like in First World War. So he said to himself, if I can get if I can require my own people to die for my country, why should the Jews go off scot-free? Why shouldn't they have to die for Germany as well? So the Holocaust was a way of requiring that the Jews be in the same position as the soldiers, also obedient unto death, giving their lives for the nation state. So in this sense, Hitler was also making an anti-war statement, because the German soldiers, when they died, it was honorable and glorious. But when the Jew died in the death camps, there was nothing honorable and glorious about their death. Okay, I'm going to look for a second on the side to see if I can respond to anything here. Someone said something about disabled studies related. No, I know nothing about disabled studies, but obviously soldiers become disabled by virtue of their participation in warfare. So there is a sense in which soldiers should be put in the category of disabled. And I'll say one radical thing before I leave, and that has to do with the whole notion of young men as being the most oppressed group in history. If you look at these statistics on World War I, 95% of the deaths were young men, probably between the age of 18 and 25. But somehow, when young men are slaughtered, we say nothing about it. There's even one historian by the name of Ferguson. He has the nerve of saying that the reason the war persisted was because the men enjoyed it. Imagine that. Imagine that. Imagine that. It's like saying the reason they had comfort women in Japan to satisfy the men was because the women enjoyed having sex with the Japanese men. They were mostly Korean, by the way. Okay, so I've said enough for today. I think I've said a lot. And now I have to decide if I'm going to give my rock and roll sign-off. I'm thinking that maybe I'll make this part of my signature in my performances. So if you can suffer through the truth, then you get a reward, as Tiny Tim used to say, because you've all been so good. So I will leave with my Jocko rocket ship performance. He was one of the great early rock and roll DJs, along with Alan Freed. Alan Freed, by the way, was the king of rock and roll, not Elvis Presley. Elvis Presley was one of the singers, but 60% of the early rock and roll groups or singers were what? Black vocal groups. The term doo-wop did not exist in the 50s. Tell that to your sons and daughters who are beyond your command. There was no doo-wop. Black vocal music was the core of rock and roll. So Alan Freed would play the Moonlows and the Eldorados, and then he would play Elvis Presley. And Chuck Berry was kind of a latecomer. He was not one of the early rock and rollers. Fats Domino was. 60% of early rock and roll was black vocal groups. So this is revisionist history to call this doo-wop and to pretend that rock and roll was white singers. There was Elvis Presley. There was Jerry Lee Lewis, a great pianist, by the way. Jerry Lewis was not a rock and roll singer. Jerry Lewis was actually from where I'm from, Irvington, New Jersey. And in those days, that was the only way you could express yourself in a rebellious way, was to be kind of spastic. In any case, Jocko, way up here in the stratosphere, you gotta holler mighty loud and clear. E to the op, ho! This is the jock on the scene with a video machine. Correct time now, 3:15. So I'm gonna sign off now. Tell your friends and neighbors that Richard Koenigsberg will be presenting these videos now and then. That's the last song made, one of the last songs made by John Lennon, by the way. If you want to hear a great piece of music, it was never formally recorded, but he's playing it on the piano. And John Lennon was, of course, very, very creative cat. So thank you so much for watching. I will now press the button here called Finish, and I look forward to meeting with you in person someday when I hold a seminar or other events that will bring these ideas into the forefront of history so that we can awaken from the nightmare of warfare. Thanks so much. Take care. See you again soon.